organizers for this important opportunity to share with you the experiences of my organization called Tenaganita, which means Women's Force. And we work with women, migrants, and refugees. Our objectives are to promote and protect the rights of the communities we are involved in, as well as to create spaces with these communities so that they can achieve their full potential in society. And with that, I think my passion for migration is also I'm a product of migrant labor. My parents were brought from India to work in the rubber plantations, and so I am not seen as an indigenous person or a Bumiputra in Malaysia, but that we became part of the citizenship when the British left and we had a social contract assured that we be part of citizens of Malaysia. And so that also tells you that migration is not new, but today it is indeed a very defining global issue. And I believe there is no country in the world today that is not affected in some way or other by migration. Yeah, and I think it's really important, and I think Professor Saskia had said to a large extent that we are really two worlds in different ways. Even within our families, we can be two worlds where we have wealth being accumulated more and more by a certain group of people who have all the facilities and so forth, while we have another world which is really of debt-ridden, poverty, despair, where the way for survival is migration. They remain voiceless and controlled in this global phenomena. And migration is actually today big business. It is highly organized. It is structured. There is a system attached to it to make money. And one of the biggest players are the recruitment agents or the brokers who really are, as I call them, the new mafia in the world. And they're very brutal. They're really brutal, and they are at all stages of migration. But it's not just the recruitment agents. Governments also make money through this structured form of migration. And this has come true, particularly if we look how the international finance institutions have influenced this form of structure and growth of migration. And I think it's important to look back because many of us, particularly a lot of donors and international organizations, support this concept of migration and development. But I have very strong issues related to this concept. And as Professor Saskia has said, that remittances are an important agenda within these areas, and they are seen as the new form of direct finance, direct investment for poverty reduction. Why do I say that? Now, when the UN organized the Global Commission on Migration, headed by Mary Robinson, it became one of the very important and I think really good reports. I was part of that process. unfortunately, and her focus and the team's focus was on human rights, that the human rights of migrants must be respected at all stages of migration. Now, what happened in between was the international finance institutions, particularly IMF and the World Bank, developed a different report called the Sutherland Report, who was a former World Bank consultant. And the Sutherland Report focused on remittances and how, through remittances, the poverty-ridden countries could now pay for the debt. Meanwhile, we were all organizing cancellation of the debt for the Golden Jubilee of the World Bank. Yeah, to cancel the world debt, to cancel from poor countries, and churches were one of those in the forefront. And here we get this report to say, hey, remittance is the way forward. And therefore, that concept was actually accepted under the UN high-level dialogue, which was held. And then a new organization or a direction called the Global Forum on Migration and Development, GFMD, was instituted. And who led GFMD, if not the corporations? Because you had the Onassis Foundation, you had the Ayala Foundation. Who are they? Corporations, the wealthy. And therefore, how can I accept that position that it is migration and development of the people when it is not of the people, but that of remittances? And so the poor countries developed what I call labor export policies. We push our people out, find markets, and so migrants became commodities for export. And we have today the human trade in migration, now pushed more and more towards this direction. Now, some of the other things I think Romeo has also mentioned, the conflict in loyalty and identity, where are we, who are we, is very fundamental to the issue in migration. And so therefore, coming to Malaysia, where are we? Malaysia is seen as rich and booming. It is one of the tiger economies of Asia. And that rich and booming economy is really built on the sweat and blood of migrant workers. The politics of the day say we will depend less and less on migrant workers. But the reality is the reliance on migrant workers increases each day. And so we have 4.6 million migrant workers, out of whom 50% are undocumented migrant workers. Now, it's also important to recognize the migrant who moves is a human being, is a mother, is a wife, is father, a caregiver, is a fighter. It's multiple identities in which that person moves on a contract labor system. But those identities are not recognized in the whole process from the experiences of the migrant workers. The second factor that really is important for us to recognize, and this too came out in Prof. Saskia's presentation, the issue of surveillance. But I take it as the question of security. And this is conflict, contradiction, and it's a little bit crazy how we deal with these kind of situations. Now, in Malaysia, the main ministry that decides on migration and migrant workers is the Home Ministry, not the Human Resources Ministry. It is the Home Ministry that approves the work permit visa. And the Home Ministry, therefore, looks at migrants as a security issue, as a security threat, rather than as a labor issue. And they, therefore, make the key decisions when it comes to migrant workers. And for me, that is very conflicting. And you need to remember this because a key factor that is there for the migrant is the issue of whether she is documented or not, or whether she has the passport or not. And that passport actually builds multiple layers of discrimination when she's recruited as a migrant worker into Malaysia, and it's the same thing for many of the countries. And so it creates a kind of a stigma between whether I'm a citizen or not, or I'm a migrant worker or not. It defines the rights I enjoy or not. And I think that's where that whole issue of documented, discriminated, criminalized comes into being. And as I speak to you today, the Malaysian government is hunting down, that's the word they use, hunting down, and that's the word Romeo also used, of hunting, being hunted down. Hunting down, and they have a special operations going on, mobilizing 135,000 personnel from police, immigration, army, and vigilante corps to hunt down 500,000, they claim, undocumented migrants in the country. And the rationale that is given to Malaysians is they are a security threat. They are the vectors of crime. And when we asked the police what percentage of the crime is committed by migrants, by 1%. And so, with that, this is the RELA, that is the new enforcers, who are actually not trained personnel. They're ordinary Malaysians recruited, and there are 1 million of them in the country for a population of 28 million people. Now, the non-recognition brings about the alienation of rights. And many of us tend to say they are called illegal. Now, as far as we are concerned, there is no illegal human being in the world. And therefore, does that mean that she's not worthy to exist and be put out of the society in which we are claimed? So this conceptual framework is really fundamental to what the claims of rights be. And in 2002, this whole crackdown is actually a cycle. In 2002, there was a massive crackdown, and we had thousands of people in Sabah who went over, Indonesians, to a little place called Nunukan, and then to the southern part of the Philippines, Tawi-Tawi. And there was a huge catastrophe that actually happened during this period, that today we have thousands of stateless children who are actually orphans because they can't track down the parents. Now, those who get arrested, what are their conditions? the arrest and detention is also something close to me, because in 1995, I exposed the conditions in immigration detention centers. And then the government denied, and then I got investigated and arrested, and they charged me for publishing false news under the Printing Presses and Publication Act. The trial went on for 13 years. At the lower courts, I was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment, but on appeal, the case went on to the High Court, and then they lost my evidence, and then the case was thrown off. But the 13 years of trial was futile. And it shows you how the government tries to push and rationalize in it. Now, what are some of the things? Is the conditions are deplorable in the immigration detention centers. And most of all it's not accessible to NGOs who want to access the detainees, who want to provide medical aid. It's not accessible at all, and that is really very challenging. Now, here are some stories of the voices of migrants, of particularly women migrants, and here's a case of a pregnant woman who was in detention, and, well, in the detention, there's no beds, nothing. You just sleep on a platform, and then you have a lot of bugs that come through, and you really suffer in those aspects. Then when she started going into labor, she started crying out to be sent to the hospital. That was not heard until all the other detainees started screaming. And then she was taken to hospital and she delivered. She's fortunate, but we had another case of how another woman baby was stillborn, and they didn't see and recognize that, and her body was actually poisoned. Now, one of the issues that I want to raise is that migrant workers, if they're found to be undocumented, they can be whipped under the Immigration Act. Yeah, and out of that fear, a lot of migrants remain in silence. Now, the Amnesty International did an investigation, and from 2005 to 2011, 34,000 migrants were whipped in Malaysia. And we actually see it as a form of torture. What does this mean, this whipping? It means that the officials tear into the flesh of prisoners with a rattan cane, traveling up to 160 kilometers per hour. The cane shreds the victim's naked skin, turns the fatty tissue into pulp, and leaves permanent scars that extend all the way to muscle fibers. Blood and flesh splash off the victim's body, often accompanied by urine and feces. This gruesome spectacle is kept hidden from public view. Many of us do not know, but this is what happens. And in my interviews with former detainees, many of them say that they have become impotent. They're not able to have any more sexual relations with their wives due to the whipping. And that has brought about severe marriage issues and problems where many of them actually have got divorced. Now, these are consequences that many of us do not realize. We are still fighting over this whipping. And this is really, for us, is an issue because why do we criminalize a person for an administrative issue? It's an administrative problem. If you do not have a proper document, you seek for the proper document, and then you get deported. Why do we need to criminalize? And I think this whole criminalization issue is really something that's growing and expanding globally, not just in Malaysia. Some of the critical factors. Now, in coming back to the actual work that we do, one of the areas that we are involved in is on domestic work. which we today consider as a modern-day form of servitude and slavery or bonded labor. And why do we say that? Is, first of all, Malaysia has actually institutionalized bonded labor because domestic workers are not recognized as workers. They are excluded from the labor laws. They are defined as domestic servants. And so by so doing it, there's absolutely no protection for the domestic worker. Second point is that domestic workers work in isolated and individualized environment. They are one group of workers where you have multiple employers, from husband, wife, in-laws to children, and only one or two workers. I think that's important to recognize. The passports are held by the employer. They cannot go out. If they go out without the passports, they can get arrested. Many of them, their wages are unpaid, not just for 1 month, but for 2 years, for 3 years. They do not have any off days, and so they cannot meet, they cannot accept for Filipino domestic workers. Even then, and today many of them do not get, only 10% of them get off days out of the total number, although their contract states they should have an off day. The recruitment agents are a major problem. If the migrant domestic worker contacts a recruitment agent and says, no, I don't want to work with this employer because of abuse, they will bring her to the recruitment agency house, beat her up, and tell her to go back and behave herself. And that's a number of cases that we have had. Now, in our case management that we have, we realize that one case that a migrant worker brings, it involves multiple violations. As I stated, withholding of passport, non-payment of wages, abuse, and so forth. So in last year, Tenaga Anita handled 255 cases of domestic workers with 1,785 human rights violations. Now, what are some of them? 100% said that their passports are held by employees. 75% the wages not paid for more than 3 months. 32% alleged sexual abuse. And that's really very worrying. 30% suffered food deprivation. In fact, one domestic worker had died of food deprivation. And the forensic analysis said that it is because of malnutrition and starvation that she died. And Malaysia is a country rich in food. And yet we have that situation. 60% alleged violence and abuse. And this is not just a slap or two. No, this is where when the high heels are taken and they hit on the head until it bleeds. This is where when we had domestic worker, one who came to our shelter, whose hands and legs were tied, and made to hop, and then she would fall, and regularly that she couldn't walk for some time. So it continues. Now, domestic workers work for more than 16 hours a day. And because of these situations and our exposure, Indonesia froze sending domestic workers. Then Cambodia followed. And so there was a big vacuum, a big demand growing. Now what happened? The domestic workers were already in the country. Their contract was extended. The domestic workers were told not to contact their families back home. That was disallowed. And so we were actually getting a lot of calls from families in Cambodia of missing girls. And on tracking and tracing down, we found that their contracts were actually forcefully extended. Now, the violations, this is a case of Nirmala, who from Indonesia, and who had a hot iron put on her back. And her case was brought up. She won the case. The employer is in prison now. Nirmala is trying to appeal for compensation currently, but now the judges are asking her to go for a psychiatric evaluation. Maybe there is a possibility it is self-inflicted. I don't know, how do you put an iron at the back of your body and it has this shape? You know, it's difficult, but that's the struggle that migrants have when they begin to assert their rights in the system. And so it's a whole denial of rights and non-declaration of rights that actually leads to a situation where they are in a very inhuman condition. I have to move fast. And so the only way forward is to get those rights recognized, as otherwise it's slavery. Now, we did a study between Hong Kong and Malaysian employers, and we found that the perceptions differ, because in Hong Kong there are quite strict laws in terms of the rights protection. The domestic workers and migrant workers can actually appeal to the Equal Opportunities Commission in Hong Kong if they are discriminated. And so that has actually helped the domestic workers to assert their rights, unlike in Malaysia. So I think core to the issue is, what are the opportunities for the rights protection of domestic workers? And this is one example we have. Now, one of the global issues that we have is this whole subcontractualization of labor. And outsourcing is one area, which is really part of the WTO agenda as well. Now, outsourcing can be done either the whole work is outsourced or the worker is outsourced. Now, when you say the whole work in a factory, the canteen is outsourced, the cleaning is outsourced. But when the production dimension is outsourced, then there will be problems because the company has to be fully responsible for that. Now, in Malaysia, from 2007, we have had this question of outsourcing of labor as a form of deregulating labor, whereby the companies are not directly responsible for the wages, the welfare, the security of employment. And this is what it is. How do corporations absorb themselves is through this form of system. And if you look at the approval of the fees charged in Malaysia, you know, when they are recruited in 2007, a large number of Bangladeshis, there are different layers of bureaucracy and agents. But what I'd like to see you is the one in red, where lobbyist fees. So when we ask what is the lobbyist fees from some of the agents, they say basically you needed to pay immigration. You needed to pay for approval. And that's basically where corruption has come in. And we must recognize that corruption is a very core factor in this whole process of labor migration. Now, one of the biggest issues we are really fighting for is the right to redress. Now, when a migrant worker has a case of unpaid wages, we then file the case in the labor court. But in Malaysia, it takes a minimum of 6 months to get through a case, sometimes even 3 years. Now, the immigration has a policy that if you have a case, they will only provide a social visa for 3 months because the employer cancels the work permit as soon as the migrant makes a complaint or leaves the workplace. And so, after the 3 months, where the migrant again has to pay 100 ringgit or 35 US dollars for the visa when he has got no wages, right? Then the immigration does not renew that visa. The migrant is not in control of the visa. And so what happens is that if we look at this case here, which we took up in 2000, And in this case, the worker actually was asking for his salary that has not been paid for 5 months. The case was filed with, and he was dismissed with the Industrial Relations Act. He was unfairly dismissed. Then the case was referred to the court, which went on for hearing, and then he was arrested because the visa was refused. He was put in prison, went to court. We did not know he was put in. He was sentenced with whipping, and before we could make the appeal, he was deported. Now that tells you what that whole process of right to redress is about. And so access is actually denied, and many of the workers decide to return because they fear the arrest and detention. And so they choose to return, and that has become problematic. So the whole aspect is really that we build an environment for slavery, we create a strong underclass that is really voiceless. The system makes it in this process. I just want to go through some of the concepts that we find that, you know, torture is not acceptable. It's international customary law. Yet, when it is practiced, nobody really speaks out when it comes to a migrant worker. And therefore, what is the change that we are looking at is that there needs to be delinking of status from employment. And I think that's very important, that your status doesn't determine, but the kind of way recruitment of migrants is structured that crimes about. The concept of equality and recognition of right to stay and right to work. And I think this is very fundamental. The right to move and work in dignity must also be accompanied by the right to stay and live in dignity in one's own place. And these are some of the issues that we are really working towards. Malaysia has not ratified most of the conventions. And so what we are addressing is that if Malaysia needs to increase its accountability, that we cannot compromise on the dignity, rights of human beings, no matter who they are. Thank you.